Good morning. My name is Douglas Griffin. This is my Sunday school class. We're going through the Bible. We started in Genesis back 4 years ago. Wow. We went through the book of Genesis, very long book. Went through Exodus, very long book. Went through Leviticus. We're almost done. We're in Leviticus chapter 25. So two more chapters to go. And interestingly enough, uh, although Leviticus is quite controversial, Numbers is where all the action happens. So the structure of the first five books of the Bible is God in Genesis lets the Jewish nation know, the children of Israel, how they got to Egypt. Then in the book of Exodus, this is how we get out of there. The book of Leviticus takes place in the very first year. It's just the very first year of their escape from Egypt, where God's kind of setting down the law. I'm about to take you back into the land that you should have been in, that I gave you back in Genesis, the land that you refused to go to. I gave you the opportunity to go to it. In fact, when Jacob died, you all left Egypt and you went back to the land I had promised you. You buried him, and then you went back to Egypt because you just chose Egypt over me. Where did that get you? And God is all for letting people learn their own lessons because, as we will learn today, God's all about choice. It's all about choice. You get to choose. So now they finally chosen to leave Egypt, although some of them chose to go back. But anyway, they've chosen to leave Egypt, and he says, I'm about to take you back to the land that I originally promised you. But before we go, let's have some ground rules. That's what Leviticus is about. In the book of Numbers, they head back there. They refuse to go in. I know that you gave us this land, Lord, but you must not have known about the giants. And that's kind of our relationship with God sometimes. We think there are things he didn't know about. Lord, I trust you, but you must not have known about this thing. So I can't really do what you said for me to do. So in the book of Numbers, that covers the 40 years which are the consequences of not obeying him initially. Okay, clearly this generation, and this is the truth, this generation is just too hooked to Egypt. And sometimes certain generations have to pass away before the next generation can move on into the promised land. So there's a generation that was just too Egypt minded. That generation had to pass away, and he finally had the people who were born in the wilderness, and that's its own. We have generation X and Z and Y. The generation that was born in the wilderness, they're their own. They have their own mindset, different than the ones who were born in the promised land. So that generation wanders for 40 years until the Egyptian generation dies out. And finally, as they're about to go in, 40 years have passed, they're about to go into the new land. In the book of Deuteronomy, God summarizes everything. Let's remind ourselves of everything that you learned during these 40 years, how we got here, what's happening, because you're about to now go in with this new generation. And I just want to remind you of all of our laws, everything that we went over. So book of Deuteronomy is kind of the summary of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers. But we're in Leviticus now where God's letting down the law. There's a couple principles that are important for us to understand the law. Paul brings up the fact that before the law ever existed, before God, through Moses, enumerated, you don't do this, don't kill, don't steal, destroy, that righteousness, as far as achieving righteousness, that came through faith. Because in Genesis, as Abraham believed God, and it was counted to him for righteousness. So faith in who God is, faith in what God is telling us to do, that's where your righteousness comes from, not from whether or not you do the law. Now, as Christians, we've changed that and we condemn people because they failed in some area of the law. You stole, you're going to hell. You killed, you're going to hell. You did this thing, you're going to hell. And that's not what the Bible says. Righteousness comes through faith. The reason God gave the law is because uh, there are three things he wanted to teach them. I need to teach you to worship me because you got really bad worship habits back in Egypt. You're used to worshiping other gods. In fact, you think there are other gods, and I've got to retrain your thinking so that you worship me. Otherwise, you're going to start worshiping these idol gods, and the sin will increase to the point where I'll have to destroy you. Uh, so let me see. Okay, told me to check my internet connection. Um, so I'm going to have to teach you how to worship me. I have to teach you how to love your neighbor so that you don't destroy one another. So uh, that's the purpose of the law, not to give you righteousness. Included in the law was forgiveness for sin, all sins. The Day of Atonement, all the thousands of sins I did not mention because you're not ever going to rise above them until you get a new heart and a new spirit. So I'm not even going to mention all those sins. They're all forgiven through the atonement. And the third thing uh, is your own personal health and safety so you don't destroy yourself. So I don't want you to destroy your relationship with me. I don't want you to destroy your neighbor. I don't want you to destroy your own personal health. And these are the things that you have to do for yourself so I can preserve you alive and eventually bring that Messiah who's going to die for the sins of the people. So all that I'm teaching about the atonement, there's one person who's going to do that once and for all, a high priest. So I'm training you about the high priest. So I've got to teach you about faith, teaching about the law. But just like Paul says, before the law ever existed, righteousness came through faith. So don't think that righteousness comes through the law. It does not. You're never going to uphold the whole law. So getting on people whether or not they sinned or didn't sin or how that's not going to make them righteous. It's going to make them healthier, probably safer, etc. But that's not where your righteousness come from. It always came through faith. Also, we have to remember that before the law was given, God came down on Mount Sinai and wanted a personal relationship with them. You'll all be a kingdom of priests. All of you will be able to come into my presence. That's my goal, is for us all to have a personal relationship. And they rejected that. So then, as a substitute, but not the permanent substitute, he created, okay, I'll have a high priest who will then go in and out before me on your behalf. But that's not, but eventually we got to get back to this personal relationship thing, just like eventually we have to get back to righteousness by faith. So God was not saying, and this is from now on, go through the preacher for everything. That was a temporary solution because the people rejected that opportunity. But God never let go of that. Like we're going to eventually get back to that. So in Leviticus, let me bring up, we're in Leviticus chapter 25. There's this other interesting thing that God does is he meets us where we're at. He still states the ultimate goal, but he knows that it takes time to change hearts. So when we got saved, uh, God did not expect, perhaps your church expected, or the person who helped you get saved, you're going to be perfect instantly. God knows that's not a truth. But he's going to put us through a series of situations where we will eventually, like the prodigal son, choose to live a certain way and say, oh, making these choices hurts me. I'm going to choose these other choices, this more healthier way, this safer way, this more uh, personal way of having a relationship with God. Only things that we choose to do are permanent in our lives. Somebody can make us do something, what we won't continue to do it until we actually see the good in it, until we actually go, oh, okay. So the people we've tried to change, you shouldn't do this, you shouldn't do that. If they haven't asked for our help, it's never permanent. We've made them do something, but as soon as they get a chance, they're going to go back to what they did because they never chose it. They don't see the why it's better for them, right? But once they can learn, oh, I see why it's better to do that, then they'll choose to do it and it'll be a permanent change in their lives. So there are things that God tells the Israelites to do in the wilderness that's just the beginning steps. But he knows that eventually they're going to choose these other things. So we're going to be frustrated with a couple things in Leviticus chapter 25. Well, why didn't God just tell them to do this? Because he's going to slowly make them choose to do it. Not make them, but help them choose to do it. And then they'll constantly do it. But if he makes it a law right now, they won't do it. They'll just fall short. So he's going to put out the goal but say it's okay if you do this. It's like teaching a child addition. 2 plus 2 is 4. Why don't you just go ahead and teach them calculus right away? I don't understand. First, they got to learn these elemental things, and then they'll continue to grow. And that's how God looks at us. Okay, so in Leviticus chapter 25, verse 1 through 7, he's reminding us. Leviticus is like a teaching lesson in that in the beginning, the first 7 or 8 chapters, he's setting down certain rules, and now he's reviewing them in the last 7 or 8 chapters. So we're not going to see something new. He's just going to review what he initially taught them. So in chapter 25, verse 1, it says, "And the Lord spoke to Moses on Mount Sinai, saying, Speak to the children of Israel and say to them, when you come into the land which I give you, then the land shall keep a Sabbath to the Lord." What do you mean? The land has to go to church on Sundays? No. In verse 3, it says, 6 years you shall sow your field. So you can dig up the land and plant and do all the things that you do when you're sowing a field. In 6 years you shall prune your vineyard and gather its fruit for yourselves, because I'm going to give each of you your own personal property land. You each get chunks of land, each of you, each tribe, and then you'll divide it up. And they really did divide it up, and you get this, you get 25th Street, you get 27th Street, you get 30th Street. They just divided it up like blocks, really. Verse 4, but in the 7th year there shall be a Sabbath of solemn rest. So again, Sabbath just means rest. It doesn't mean Sunday. It doesn't mean Saturday. It just means rest. Give me one day where you're not doing something. So your Sabbath might be on a Tuesday. God may have you working on a Saturday and Sunday. He's not mad at you. Maybe your day off is Tuesday. Sabbath just means rest. So in the 7th year, there shall be a Sabbath of solemn rest for the land, a Sabbath to the Lord. You shall neither sow your field nor prune your vineyard. Don't do anything. Verse 5, what grows of its own accord of your harvest, you should not even reap, nor gather the grapes of your untended vine, for it is a year of rest for the land. So it's supposed to just sit there, meaning I gave you some land. Do not you go out and gather that on that 7th year for yourself. In that 7th year, just let it grow. He said you can actually eat from it, but you don't take it all away and bring it into your house like you did every other year. Verse 6 says, and the Sabbath produce of the land shall be food for you. You get to eat some, but it's for you, it's for your male and female servants, your hired man, and the stranger who dwells with you, the immigrant who comes in. Anybody on that 7th year can have they can come onto your land and eat. It's not a problem. Not a problem. And because I'm going to give you so much abundance in year 6 that'll cover your 7. And you can go out and eat. It's not like you can't eat it, but don't take it all away. Leave it hanging there for other people. There needs to be 1 year every 7 years that you are just providing for other people. Verse 7, for your livestock and the beasts that are in your land, all its produce shall be for food. So you got it for 1 year. Let the land rest. And there's this principle in farming where you're supposed to let the land rest for a year. Otherwise, you eventually dry it out. It stops producing. And we have whole areas where that has happened because we haven't used this principle of let the land just rest for a year, and I'll farm somewhere else. Like, no, we got to get as much as we can, and now, okay, well, we can't use this ground anymore. So every 7 years, do nothing. 14 years, that'd be 2 years of doing nothing. 21 years, that'd be 3 years of doing nothing. 49 years, that's 7 years total over that 49 period where you've done nothing. 490 years have passed. There's got to be 70 years where you let the land rest for 70 years, right? Every 7th year. So after 490 years, there should have been 70 times where you didn't do anything. Now, unfortunately, Israel didn't listen to that. It's not going to do it. So, Exodus chapter 23, verse 10. Again, this was even before Leviticus, just reminding us, Exodus 23, 10. 6 years you shall sow your land and gather in its produce, but the 7th year you shall let it rest and lie fallow, that the poor of your people may eat, and what they leave, then the beasts of the field may eat. In like manner you should do with your vineyard and your olive grove. 1 year just give, let other people eat. Now, he didn't qualify which poor. We qualify today which poor. We say, well, if you, that was kind of your own fault, so I'm not going to help you. And God didn't say that. He didn't say, well, but the poor who, where it wasn't their fault. He just says the poor. Let them eat for a year and don't do anything to the land. Because he's saying the land is mine, by the way. I'm letting you live on the land. The earth is the Lord's, the Bible would say. And that's not just oh, what a beautiful statement. The earth is the Lord's. No, he's saying that because he says, by the way, the earth is mine. I'm letting you live on my earth. So these are my rules. You're free to invent another planet, and then you can do what you want there. But this is mine, and so you have to follow my rules. Sorry. In Second Chronicles, so again, 490 years are supposed to have gone by. This is around the year 1200 when he first gave this, when they first went into the land. Now, and again, we're counting backwards toward Jesus, 1200, 1100, 1000, 900, 800, 600, and then we're there. That's all BC to where Jesus is going to show up. So 1200 years before Jesus, that's about the time they go into the land. 500 years later, 490 years, year 710, because 500 years would have been the year 700. By the 710, God gives an announcement to them. Because again, remember, they're supposed to have done this every 7 years. And after 490 years, there should have been 70 times, 70 years worth of, they didn't do anything. They just let the land sit there. But they went, hey, what's God going to do? Okay. Second Chronicles chapter 36, verse 19. Babylon invades. And in Second Chronicles chapter 36, and it starts capturing all these people, and he takes them off to bondage. Verse 19 says, then they burned the house of God. They broke down the wall of Jerusalem. They burned all its palaces with fire and destroyed all its precious possessions. And those who escaped from the sword, he carried away to Babylon. This is the king of Babylon, where they became servants to him and his sons until the rule of the kingdom of Persia. So Babylon, which is modern day Iraq, the king of Iraq came down, carried them all into captivity until Iran, that's king of Persia, modern day Iran, came, and Iran, thank you so much. Iran, they did not ran. Iran, they came and conquered Babylon and eventually let the Jews go back to Israel, back to their land, back to Canaan, which is at that point called Israel. So those who escaped the sword, verse 20 of 2 Chronicles 36, he carried away to Babylon, where they became servants to him and his sons until the rule of the kingdom of Persia, to fulfill the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah, until the land had enjoyed her Sabbaths. As long as she lay desolate, she kept Sabbath to fulfill 70 years. So for 70 years, there was no one in Israel. And the land got to get her Sabbaths because God said, the land is mine and she gets a Sabbath. And if you don't do it when I tell you to do it, you'll eventually do it anyway. Like the people who hold on to their money, I'm not tithing. Well, actually, you are going to tithe. You could have tithed of your own free will, but that money you have, I gave that to you. So I'm going to get it back. So that land I gave you, that's mine. I told you I need 70 years of where it's doing nothing, where you're allowing the poor to eat and your servants. And so you owe me 70 years. So it says, verse 21 again of 2 Chronicles 36, to fulfill the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah. Jeremiah prophesied what was going to happen until the land had enjoyed her Sabbaths. As long as she lay desolate, she kept Sabbath to fulfill 70 years. So that was the first rule. Let the land lay dormant. Otherwise, I'll just get my 70 years anyway. Leviticus chapter 25, verse 6. talking about the year of Jubilee. So this is different than the every 7 year you have that Sabbath rest for the land. Now we're talking about freedom for the people. I think I call this lesson uh, ownership and freedom. Ownership and freedom. Um, who owns the land and what is freedom? And you shall count verse. Okay, I'm going to start with verse 8, apparently. And you shall count seventh Sabbaths of years for yourself. Seventh Sabbaths of years, 7 years. 7 times 7 years. 7 times 7. 7 times 7, 49. And the time of the seventh Sabbath of years shall be to you 49 years. Just in case you can't do math in your head. You're going to count 49 years. Then you shall cause the trumpet of the Jubilee to sound on the 10th day of the 7th month, on the Day of Atonement. That Day of Atonement, everyone's been freed from their sins. It's a time to be solemn for all the time leading up to it, during Yom Kippur, right? During Rosh Hashanah, all the time period leading up to the Day of Atonement. And now there's a celebration because everything's been forgiven. So on the Day of Atonement, just like I've forgiven you all of your debts, forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors, right? It's just like I've forgiven you all your debts. You are to forgive everybody else their debts. You're going to do it every 50 years on the Day of Atonement. Time for celebration. On the Day of Atonement, you shall make the trumpet to sound throughout all your land. Verse 10 of Leviticus 25. And you shall consecrate the 50th year and proclaim liberty throughout all the land to all its inhabitants. It shall be a jubilee for you, and each of you shall return to his possession, and each of you shall return to his family. So when people got in debt in those days, the way they paid off their debt is they went to work for somebody. So that barter system. You'll come live with me. I'll take hold of your land and you'll work for me. Maybe a year, maybe 2 years, maybe 10. It depends on how huge your debt is. And it doesn't matter how you got into it, was your fault, doesn't matter. But on the year of Jubilee, so somebody who was really in debt on year 48 and went to somebody, worked for somebody on the year of Jubilee, 2 years later, they were freed. Doesn't matter how big their debt was. If you went into debt in year 20, you worked for 30 years, but on the year of Jubilee, in that 50th year, you were freed. It didn't matter how big the debt was. Everybody, even if a month had gone by, and that's when you suddenly found yourself in a bad situation. A month later, you're free. On the year of Jubilee, everybody's free, period. And you get to go back to your land and back to your house, and they have to give it back to you. All debts are cleared. Verse 10, and you shall consecrate the 50th year and proclaim liberty throughout all your land to all its inhabitants. And so it'll be a jubilee for you. And each of you shall return to his possession, and each of you shall return to his family. That 50th year shall be a jubilee to you, verse 11. In it you shall neither sow nor reap what grows of its own accord, nor gather the grapes for your untended vine. Again, that's that. Just let people eat all throughout the land. Everybody gets to eat. Everybody's free. Our debts are erased. For it is Jubilee, verse 12. It shall be holy to you. Shall eat its produce from the field. And he says, well, let's go into verse 13, Leviticus 25. In this year of Jubilee, each of you shall return to his possession. Now, if you sell anything to your neighbor or buy from your neighbor's hand, you shall not oppress one another. So this is a second principle. So you get your land back, you're free of debt, and it says earlier, so that your neighbor can live with you. If they're constantly in poverty, if they're constantly oppressed, they're eventually either going to starve to death through depression, they're going to become a thief and steal from you, or they're going to be angry at you because if everybody's debt is released, then we can, and it doesn't matter, but it was your fault, so therefore I'm not releasing your debt. The people who, had a natural tragedy, tornadoes came, hurricane wiped them out, those people we forgive those debt. But people who you made your own bad choices, God didn't qualify it. This person needs to be able to live with you. It'll be better for you if you don't create a permanent underclass. It'll be better for you that the people living next door to you have the opportunity to start over and create a new life and make better choices. It'll be better for you. But if you create this permanent underclass of people who are in debt and then their children in debt, and their children in debt, that will not be good for you, especially if these are your brothers. This is talking about your brethren. Actually, interestingly, I'm not talking about the stranger who's come in the land, but that's a separate thing. We'll get to in just a minute. Now, in verse 14 it says, if you sell anything to your neighbor or buy from your neighbor's hand, don't oppress one another. If you sell something, don't inflate the price of it. This land, I know it's only 12 feet by 12 feet, but it's worth $500,000. Or if you buy something from your neighbor, that land, that 12 by 12, that's only worth $4. I'm only going to give you $4. Don't cheat each other. Don't inflate or underinflate. Be fair. Do not oppress one another. Verse 15, according to the numbers of years after the Jubilee, you shall buy from your neighbor. Okay, so here's how they would value the land. It's going to be, you got 50 years to the next Jubilee. So let's calculate how much produce will be produced in this land over the next 50 years. And then that's the cost. Oh, it's only 20 years to the next Jubilee? Then we'll calculate, because it does 10 bushels a year. So 20 times 10, that's the cost. There's only 5 years to the next Jubilee, and it does 10 bushels a year. Okay, then it's 5 times 10. That's the cost of the land, because they would measure the cost of the land by how much it produced. So verse 15, according to the number of years after the Jubilee, you shall buy from your neighbor. And according to the number of years of crops, he shall sell to you. How many crops am I going to get from this land? That's how much it's worth. 16, according to the multitude of years, you shall increase its price, and according to the fewer number of years, you shall diminish its price. According to the multitude, it's going to be 50 years, so that's how you increase the price. It's only going to be 3 years to the next Jubilee. I'm only going to get this land for 3 years. Then you diminish its price, right? So according to the multitude of years, you shall increase its price. According to the fewer number of years, you shall diminish its price. For he sells to you according to the number of years of the crops. How much crops am I going to get from this land? That's how much its value is. Verse 17. Therefore you shall not oppress one another, but you shall fear your God. For I'm the Lord your God. Because if you do something like that, I'm going to suddenly send a fire down and burn that whole thing up anyway. Because for a season, the wicked prosper, and we get upset. And the Bible says, don't be upset at the wicked who prospers in his way. For the Lord knows the way of the godly, but the way of the ungodly will eventually perish. People get caught in their stuff, and it eventually comes on them. So you need to fear me, God saying, if you're oppressing one another, I'm eventually going to get you. Leviticus chapter 25, I'm skipping out to verse 23. The land shall not be sold permanently, for the land is mine. So you don't own the land, you're renting it. We actually have that. This is why we have property taxes, because we have a principle that the land belongs to America. So you're owning the house you build on it is yours, but the land, and so you have to pay property taxes on it. And they got that actually from the Bible. The land is mine. You're leasing it, so you can't sell permanently. I've told you, I've given you this land, I've given you that land, I've given you that land. If you sell your land, you get it back eventually. If you buy from somebody else, you got to give it back to them eventually, because it's not yours. It's mine, and I've determined who's going to live where and who's going to do what. For you are strangers and sojourners with me. You're like an immigrant in this land as far as I'm concerned. I was here first, so I'm letting you stay in my land. Verse 24, and in all the land of your possessions you shall grant redemption of the land. The land is able to be redeemed, and people are to buy it back. That's what redemption is. We've been redeemed. God has bought us back through the blood of Christ. You're able to redeem the land. The person is able to buy their land back. You don't say, nope, I own it permanently. Sorry, not land. The house is a different subject. Leviticus chapter 25, verse 29. If a man sells a house in a walled city, he may redeem it within a whole year after it's sold. You have 1 year to redeem that house. But within a full year, he may redeem it. But if it is not redeemed within the space of a full year, verse 30, then the house in the walled city shall belong permanently to him who bought it. Throughout the generations, it shall not be released in Jubilee. The land you don't get to own. But that thing that you made, that man-made thing, that's yours. If you bought it, you get to keep it because you made that. And God wants us to separate the man-made things from God-made things. That club you invented, that government you created, I didn't create that. That kingdom that you created, that's yours. You can do whatever you want with it. My kingdom has rules. So I'm inviting you into my kingdom because I have specific rules. But that thing that you invented, that's yours. How can I want to say this in the right way? Um, I know that there is a philosophy that God wants us to go into every area, and He does, every area of life. Um, that's fine. But we have this philosophy that we're supposed to take over certain things. And God says, no, that's a man made thing. I have my own kingdom. That anything that's man made, man can have that. I don't mind influencing it. I don't mind there being Christians in it. But that's a man made system, that financial system, that political system, that whatever. That's something you came up. I have my own kingdom with its own rules. Like the first shall be last, and you worked 12 hours, you get the same amount as a person who worked 1 hour. And none of that financially makes sense in your system. And the first being last doesn't make any sense in your system. But my kingdom is totally different. And you've been forgiven for all sins. And my system is totally different than any man-made system. So don't confuse them. You can be in any system you want and be a light that will shine, that will pull them out of that system into mine. But I'm not trying to get you to take over those systems. That house, that's theirs. You built that house, that's yours. You have to, in the year of Jubilee comes, but this land is mine. And God's constantly trying to separate the secular from the holy. Okay, verse 33. If a man purchases a house from the Levites, though, then the house that was sold in the city of his possession shall be released in the year of Jubilee. Because the Levites don't have land. So that house, the Levites get back, because that's all they have. Because I didn't give the Levites land. So the house that was sold in the city of his possession, verse 33, shall be released in the Jubilee. For the houses and the cities of the Levites are their possession among the children of Israel. That's all they got. Lending to the poor. Verse 35 of Leviticus 25. If one of your brethren becomes poor, it doesn't say how they became poor. And we really do like to judge how somebody became poor. But it doesn't say that. And God isn't shocked by it. And God's saying, when this happens, because it's going to happen, people make bad decisions. Some affect them emotionally, some affect them socially, they have no friends. Affect them emotionally. Now they're always sad all the time. Some affect them politically. They affect them mentally. They affect them financially. We make bad decisions, and some people make financial bad decisions. Some of us make emotional bad decisions, or we all of us do it. All. So somebody becoming poor is going to be part of it. They're going to make bad decisions. We're forgiven for our moral bad decisions. We're forgiven for our emotional bad decisions. But we don't want to forgive people for their financial bad decisions. It's really interesting. So it just says if one of your brethren becomes poor. It doesn't say how they became poor. If they became poor and it was their own fault. And there are times when God goes into details like that. This is not a situation where He does. If one of your brethren becomes poor and falls into poverty among you, then you shall help him, like a stranger or a sojourner, that he may live with you. Again, as I was saying earlier, the poor person, it is not to your personal advantage to create a permanent underclass that is constantly depressed and upset because they are constantly in poverty and under stress like that. That person's going to do harm to themselves or eventually do harm to you. So if you want them to live with you, and he's talking about your brother, if one of your brothers, because he's going to distinguish between the brother and the foreigner, and I'll tell you why in a minute. But if your brother becomes poor, then you have to help him. It says you shall help him. Like maybe you shall help him, like a stranger or sojourner, that he may live with you. So in the same way you would help a stranger or sojourner, that he may live with you. Now, take no usury or interest from him. If you give him money, don't add interest that will keep him in poverty. Allow him to pay you back. There are some people take out a $20,000 loan, and after 20 years, they've paid $60,000 on it. And they look and they still owe 15. And they go, how's that possible? When will I ever be free of this? And so they're kept they're never able to rise above their situation and make entrepreneurial choices and do these great things with their life because they're always under that bondage from that original loan. He says, take no usury or interest, verse 36, from him, but fear your God, that your brother may live with you. Allow him to be able to pay it back. Verse 37, you should not lend him your money for usury, for interest, nor lend him your food at a profit. Verse 38, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt to give you the land of Canaan to be your God. I'm the one, you were in bondage. Hello, and I brought you out. So if I'm doing this for you, you have to help somebody else out of their bondage. So he's trying to, do you understand this reciprocal principle? Do unto others if you have them do unto you, but have them do unto you, but do unto others as I have done to you. When you were slaves, I brought you out, and you weren't able to pay me back, and yet I did that for you. Help bring your brother out of the poverty that they're in, the bondage that they're in. Okay. Now, here's the principle. Okay, laws concerning slavery. Verse 39. And if one of your brethren who dwells by you becomes poor and sells himself to you, because that's how they would get out of it, I'll come work for you for the next 6 years to pay this off. You shall not compel him to serve as a slave. So in two ways, the type of work you give him cannot be slave labor, and you cannot consider him a slave, not somebody that you permanently own. Verse 40, as a hired servant and a sojourner, he shall be with you, like a traveler, somebody who's coming in, traveled to your land, and he's working temporarily to make enough money to travel to the next place. And shall serve with you until the year of Jubilee. So if Jubilee is 40 years away or 30 years away or whatever his debt is, if he only has 7 years worth of debt, then he only works for 7 years. But however long he works for you on the year of Jubilee, done. Verse 41, and then he shall depart from you on the year of Jubilee, he and his children with him, because maybe his children had to work for you also, and shall return to his own family. He shall return to the possession of his fathers. So now he can build a life again. For they are my servants whom I brought out of the land of Egypt. They shall not be sold as slaves. Talking about your brother. Now, you shall not rule over him with rigor, but you shall fear your God. So you don't treat him like a slave. And as for your male and female slaves, whom you do have, from the nations that are around you, from them you may buy male and female slaves. Now he's talking about the Moabites, the Ammonites, the Edomites, and the Syrians. So let's just two principles. They were allowed. Now all nations had slaves. All nations had slaves. That was a thing, and the Israelites are thinking, well, who's going to do this slave labor if you're not allowing me to hire these people and have them do slave labor? We have to have slaves to build our own temples and build our this cinema. And that's their mindset, that all countries had slaves. They sold their brother Joseph into slavery. I mean, that was like they didn't go, what? I can't believe the Ishmaelites are coming by here. I can't believe it. Oh, look, they're coming. Here, sell your brother off to them. So slavery was like a common practice all over the place. Joseph did a new thing in that in Egypt, he worked it out so that the Egyptians became slaves to other Egyptians. Becoming slave to your brother was a new thing. You made slaves of people from other countries. And not that God thought it was right, it's just what people did. But you never made slave of your brothers. But under Joseph, he had worked it out so the Egyptians slowly gave away their food, and he bought up all their land, and the Egyptians became slaves to other Egyptians. And so making your brother a slave was a new thing, but the Israelites had learned that. So he's saying, don't do like they did in Egypt. Don't make your brother a slave. Do not do that, even though that's what you saw. And also, but you can uh, get slaves from the Moabites, the Ammonites, Edomites, and Syrians. Now, it doesn't say that, but it says that in the Bible. Um, the Moabites and the Ammonites were the children of Lot. This was their cousins. So Lot's first two kids by his daughters were Moab and Ammon. So the Moabites and Ammonites. You can make them slaves. The Edomites, this is Esau's kids, and the Syrians, who were not Canaanites. Any Canaanite was fair game. Now, first, I just want to explain the principle of this. So, as I said earlier, when God takes us and as a new Christian, he knows where we're going to eventually end up, but he doesn't make us start there. Like as a new student of math, he knows where you're going to eventually end up as an engineer and designing buildings and stuff, but you don't start there. He's going to build you to it. God's eventually going to eliminate slavery as a concept in their mind. The people they could not make slaves were their brothers. Eventually, he's going to change their mind as to who is their brother. He's going to expand that, but he's going to make clear because they're going to rebel against no slavery. Well, why didn't God just say no? Because they weren't going to do that. So he says, let's make this separation. Your brothers cannot be slaves. You can make slaves of the Moabites, your cousins, but you cannot make slaves of the Canaanites because you eventually will have to destroy them. So let's think about that. Why? Why do they get to destroy the Canaanites? Why? So they get to commit genocide against the Canaanites? Explain. Deuteronomy chapter 20, verse 16. This is the summation. But of the cities of these people which the Lord your God gives you as an inheritance, you shall let nothing that breathes remain alive. This is they're about to go in. Deuteronomy is a summation. I'm summing up everything we've done the past 40 years, and now you're about to go in the land. When I send you in there, these specific cities, nothing can remain alive. Verse 17, but you shall utterly destroy them. The Hittite, the Amorite, the Canaanite, although they were all Canaanites, the Perizzite, the Hivite, the Jebusite, just as Lord your God has commanded you. These are the people that you're going to destroy. Not the Moabites, not your cousins, not Esau's kids, not Lot's kids, not the Syrians, because they are not Canaanites. Verse 18, lest they teach you to do according to all their abominations which they have done for their gods, and you sin against Lord your God. So one reason, there's three reasons they were going to be destroyed. One is you're going to pick up their habits. So I need you to look at them as the enemy. You're going to pick up their habits, and then you're going to begin to worship their gods, and then I'll have to destroy you. So one reason is because the Canaanites were specifically the most wicked people on earth. And these are just small tribes of people. This is just a small collection of people, interestingly. If you've seen Israel, Israel's not that big. Israel's about as big as California or something, not even that big. It's not that big, and it's a whole country. If you imagine all the United States was squeezed into California, although sometimes it feels that way, Israel's not that big. So we're not talking about some huge genocide taking up the whole world, but the Canaanites specifically, God was going to punish. Why? Now, Genesis chapter 9, verse 25, after the flood, Noah gets drunk. He's got three sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Ham has discovered the nakedness of his father. He did that through Canaan, his own son. His own son somehow was crazy. Ham's son, Canaan. Now, Ham had a bunch of sons. Mizraim, who eventually founded Egypt, and I forget their name, the one who founded Nigeria and Ethiopia and Iraq, and all these great nations came out of Ham. But he had one son, Canaan, his younger son, who had some sort of problem. So in Genesis chapter 9, verse 25, and some of you may remember 4 years ago when we were teaching on Genesis, where I went into this in depth. It says, so Noah awoke from his wine and knew that his younger son had done to him. The translation of younger son could mean grandson or son. It's translated grandson or son, either way. Uh, they didn't have a word for grandson. So the only way to know is this grandson or son is to read the context. Verse 25 says, Then he said, Cursed be Canaan. Now Canaan is his grandson. He didn't say cursed be Ham. He said cursed be Canaan. So this should not have been translated younger son. This should have been translated grandson. He knew what his grandson had done to him. So he's awakened from his, and he's naked. And somehow when he woke up naked and there was a blanket on him, he knew what his grandson had done to him. And he said, Cursed be Canaan. A servant he shall be to his brethren. And he cursed Canaan. Now, Canaan had his own kids, and they stayed in Canaan land. All the Canaanites, all the tribes that came from Canaan, stayed in Canaan. Everybody else moved away. All of Ham's other kids, Shem's other kids moved to Mesopotamia, and Japheth's kids moved to Europe. If you were here, I went over the whole table of nations and who moved to Russia and who moved to China, and who they all went and spread out all over. But the Canaanites stayed there in Canaan. Canaan's kids stayed there. They were father to Sodom and Gomorrah and Tyre and Sidon, all these phenomenally wicked cities, like just more than anybody. Canaan had a problem, and he passed that on to his kids. So if you're talking about killing and raping people and doing all that, that's the Canaanites. That's the Canaan's kids were crazy. Ham's other kids like created Egyptian and huge empires, but the Canaanites just stayed this wicked people, epitomized by Sodom and Gomorrah. That's Canaan's kids. So God comes to Abraham years later after Shem. Abraham came from the line of Shem, and after everybody spread out, and Shem is in the, Abraham's in the Ur of the Chaldees, and he brings him over to Canaan. He says, okay, you're eventually going to get this land because this land is cursed. I've allowed these people for 400 years to change, and they have not changed. They've only gotten worse. So you're eventually going to get this land. But he tells them in Genesis chapter 15:13, then he said to Abram, know certainly that your descendants will be stranger in the land that's not theirs, and will serve them, and they will afflict them. 400 years will go by between the time I'm telling you this and the time that you come back. Here will be a 400-year period, and during that time period, your descendants are going to be basically slaves in Egypt, and then I'm going to bring them back. Verse 14, and also the nation whom they serve I will judge. So don't worry, I'm going to judge the Egyptians. Afterward they shall come out with great possessions, which they did. They came out of Egypt with great possessions and came back to that land of Canaan. At that time, it was only Abraham and a bunch of crazy Canaanites. Now, verse 15, as for you, you shall go to your fathers in peace. You should be buried in good old age, but in the fourth generation, they shall return here. Why that long? For the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete, is not yet full. I'm giving them an opportunity to repent, but at a certain point, like you're filling a measuring cup, it's going to be full and running over, and now I've got to come and judge them. So I'm giving them 400 years. They know what they're doing is wicked. I've sent prophets to them. I've sent priests. They know, but I'm going to give them 400 years to repent. And like Sodom and Gomorrah, and in fact, I'll judge Sodom and Gomorrah so they'll already know, ooh, that's really bad. That lava came down on them. Maybe we shouldn't do that. 400 years to change. So sin, their own personal sin is the second reason. One reason was they're so wicked that you're going to follow their gods and then I'll have to destroy you. Secondly, their own personal sin is so great, I will have to destroy them. But the other reason is they're going to attack you. It's going to be self-defense. So it's not, I'm sending you to destroy a whole bunch of nations. These people are going to have this insanity about you and want to kill you. Will have an insanity, like they'll want to wipe you out from the face of the earth. There's a certain people that want to wipe all Israelites from the face of the earth. And that's what they're going to want to do to you. And in order to survive, you'll have to do it to them first. Which is what happened. You read Joshua chapter 2, verse 10. And again, everybody knew uh, that the Israelites were coming out of Egypt. Uh, when they're about to attack Jericho, it says, "We heard how the Lord dried up the water of Red Sea for you when you came out of Egypt, and what you did to the two kings of the Amorites who are on the other side of the Jordan, Sihon and Og, whom you utterly destroyed." Why did they utterly destroy Sihon and Og? Because they attacked them. So we've heard about it. We know about your God, and we're still not going to repent. Sorry, we're going to try to destroy you. People were constantly trying to destroy the Jews and wipe them out, and they hadn't done anything. They'd been in Egypt for 200 years. They're just simply trying to return to their land, and people are trying to annihilate them. Deuteronomy chapter 20, verse 10. Uh, when you go near a city to fight against it, proclaim and offer a peace to it. Don't wipe them out at first. Say, we want to be peaceful with you. And it shall be that if they accept your offer of peace and open to you, then all the people who are found in it shall be placed under tribute to you and serve you, that you don't have to destroy them. Give them peace first. Now that city will not make peace with you, but war against you, then you shall besiege it. If they attack you, so they offered peace to many of these, and they, nope, we're going to kill you, we're going to wipe you out. Okay. And when the Lord your God delivers it into your hands, and you shall strike every male in it with the edge of the sword. Don't kill the women and children. Kill all the males. It goes on to say what to do with women and children. This is Deuteronomy chapter 20, verse 10 through 13. And so that's what they did. They offered peace, wouldn't accept it. Exodus 17, verse 8. Now Amalek came and fought with Israel in Rephidim. Israel's just walking, and Amalek came and attacked them from behind. Numbers chapter 14, verse 45. Then Amalek and the Canaanites who dwelled in that mountain came down and attacked them and drove them back as far as Hormah. Just attack. They're not doing anything to them. The children of Israel just trying to get back to their land. They're being attacked. Deuteronomy 2:32. Then Sihon and all his people came out against us to fight at Jahaz. Joshua 9:15. So Joshua made peace with them and made a covenant with them to let them live, and the rules of the congregation swore to them. So there was a certain group that Joshua was able to make peace with them. But here's what happened to those people. It's the Gibeonites. Joshua chapter 10. So in Joshua 9, he made peace with a certain people. Joshua 10, verse 3 through 4. Therefore Adonizedek, king of Jerusalem, sent to Horham, king of Hebron, Piram, king of Jarmuth, Japhia, king of Lachish, and Debir, king of Eglon, saying, and these are all before Israel had taken over the land. So the king of Jerusalem is a Canaanite at this point. Come up to me and help me, that we may attack Gibeon, for it has made peace with Joshua and the children of Israel. And like, we can't have that. We're going to have to destroy them so that we can then go and destroy the children of Israel. Verse 6, and the men of Gibeon sent to Joshua at the camp of Gilgal, saying, do not forsake your servants. Come up quickly, save us and help us. For all the kings of the Amorites who dwell in the mountains have gathered together against us. So Joshua ascended from Gilgal, he and all the people of war with him, and all the mighty men of valor, and they went and attacked. And again, these people are attacking them. So so that's the third reason. God saying, you're going to have to destroy them because you're going to worship their gods, and they're going to lead you into horrible sin. You have to destroy them just because it's time. I've given them 400 years to repent, and their particular sin is the worst on the earth. Sodom and Gomorrah was just a hint of things to come. But thirdly, they're going to all attack you and try to wipe you off the face of the earth. And the tribes that came to Balaam and say, curse the curse the Israelites. We've got to curse them, and so that we can wipe them out, we must destroy them. God says, you've got to destroy those people. They will never rehabilitate. They will always be trying to wipe you off the face of the earth. Saul did not destroy all the Amalekites. And sure enough, in the book of Esther, a descendant of the Amalekites, Haman, had an edict passed to totally eliminate all the Jews and wipe them off the face of the earth. And it was just a miracle of God that saved them. And so this is the reason God's saying you have to destroy them all. Now, but you can make slaves of the Moabites, your cousins, you can make slaves of them. Back to Leviticus chapter 25, and I'm almost done, verse 46. You may take them as an inheritance for your children after you, to inherit them in possession. They shall be your permanent slaves. So your cousins you can make permanent slaves. These other people, you cannot make permanent slaves. You must wipe them all out because they're going to just keep trying to destroy you. But these people can make permanent slaves. But regarding your brethren, the children of Israel, you should not rule over one another with rigor. So he's saying, if somebody's considered your brother, you can't make them a slave. But yeah, okay, those people, those only people you can make permanent slaves. Now, again, the children of Israel are going to do this no matter what. Everybody had slaves. But he's trying to teach them, but if they're your brother, you can't make them your slave. Now, in Mark chapter 12, because remember I told you God plants something that later he's going to pay off. He plants something in second grade that in 12th grade is going to pay off. And you shall, Mark 12, verse 30, Jesus says, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, with all your strength. This is the first great commandment. And the second is like it, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. There is no commandment greater than these, right? And they said, well, who's my neighbor? In Luke chapter 10, verse 28, he says, verse 29. Well, who's my neighbor? Jesus wanted to justify, the man wanted to justify himself. Well, who's my neighbor then? Because I have to love my neighbor. So you can love your brother, but now you have to love your neighbor. So he gives the parable of the Samaritan, which makes them crazy. That person who's ethnically different than you and worships a different God than you do and worships a different way, that's your neighbor. But you have to love your neighbor. Oh, I'm so mad because he's expanding the definition of a neighbor because they know they got to love their neighbor. You got to love your brother. Everyone's your brother. You got to love your neighbor. But I get to hate my enemies, right? That's why Matthew chapter 5, verse 43 says, you've heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, got to love your enemies. So I'm expanding it that you got to love everybody now. Everybody you got to consider your brother. So I knew you're going to make, so you can't make anybody a slave now because everybody in the world is your brother. Even my enemies, yeah, even your enemies. So I'm teaching you to love everybody. And so so God knew at this time they're going to make slaves. So let me say, if you're a brother, you can't make him a slave. And I'll just expand the definition of brother as we go. And that's what has happened. Okay, so this last verses. Verse 20, Leviticus 25, verse 47. If a stranger close to you becomes rich, and one of your brethren who dwells by him becomes poor and sells himself to the stranger, or sojourner close to you, or to a member of the stranger's family, after he is sold, he may be redeemed again. One of his brothers may redeem him. So some foreigner has become rich, and your brother sells himself, you can buy him back. Verse 50. Thus he shall reckon with him who bought him. The price of his release shall be according to the number of years. Well, how much do I pay for him? From the years he was sold to him until the year of Jubilee. Remember, that's how we reckon. Because on the year of Jubilee, everybody goes free. So you count how much years worth of labor might he have done. 2 years, 10 years, 50, however many years it is to Jubilee, that's his price. Verse 55, 54 and 55, the last two verses of chapter 25. If he's not redeemed in these years, then he shall be released in the year of Jubilee. Sorry, he and the children with him. Verse 55, for the children of Israel are servants to me. They are my servants, whom I bought out of the land of Egypt. I'm the Lord your God, and you cannot keep anybody in permanent bondage. So your brother gets to go free. People get to go free. That's the principle, so that they may live with you. And that's the principle of this, the principle of ownership. We don't own anything. We don't own the land. God owns it. And the principle of freedom, which is at a certain point, all people have to be made to feel free from debt, whatever that is. They need to be emotionally free. They need to be morally free from the law. They need to be socially free, financially free. God gives us all freedom. And as Christians, we spread that and we help draw people out of bondage. The reason he keeps saying, I brought you out of the land of Egypt, saying, I brought you, you did not bring yourselves out of Egypt. You weren't able to free yourself from that bondage. I brought you out. So please help others who are not able to free themselves from whatever that bondage is. Psychological bondage, emotional bondage, past trauma bondage, whatever that bondage is, help bring them out. Help bring out the people who cannot help themselves. You could not help yourselves when you were in Egypt. I brought you out. Do the same thing to others. Okay, thank you so much for listening. We will, I think next week we finish Leviticus. I think we do 2 chapters in 1. So I appreciate the time you've taken to listen. On Wednesdays, I am teaching the book of Luke, and we're learning some interesting things. All right, thank you so much. All right, bye-bye.